Hello, I'm delighted to be here today. I'd like to thank the Susan B. Anthony List for the invitation, and I'd like to thank the other panelists for their terrific presentations. I'm in the field of philosophy, so I like to go first because philosophers mostly say things and then other people back them up with actual data. But I'm at the end, so I'm going to do my best to try to characterize what I'm calling the new feminism. Really, we could just call it a new perspective maybe on what it means to be pro-woman, what it means to be in favor of the advancement of women and the cause of women. And in fact, feminism has been a term that many women do not identify with, maybe this invisible group that Professor Wilcox was describing. Late colleague of ours and Professor of Women's Studies, Chair of the Women's Studies Department for a time at Emory University, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, wrote a book entitled Feminism is Not the Story of My Life, where she interviewed many women at length and asked them about their home, their families, their priorities, and she said many of them did really not identify themselves as feminists, even though some of them were employed full-time, some of them had professional careers and so forth. They did not think of themselves as feminists. And I think that's because, as Professor Popeil was saying in the beginning, there's been so far a sense that, or in the last 20 years or so, a sense that there's only one kind of feminism, that if you're pro-woman, you are pro-choice or pro-abortion, and that is a linchpin to advancing the cause of women. So we are here to offer some other possible ways of being pro-women. I think the first emphasis of this kind of approach is what I'm calling a personal focus. That is, persons are the center of everything else we do. The women's movement for many years has been focused on goals that I think are perfectly legitimate: greater power, prestige, influence, wealth, greater heft, you might say, in the public square. But these things are only means to an end, and I think that women are especially sensitive to that, aware of that all of those are means to ends. The end is making a world that's worthy of our children and making our children worthy of such a world. So the goal is to promote the genuine good of each individual person and the genuine good of our society, the common good, you might say. It's a fashion amongst some political philosophers these days to profess a kind of ignorance about the good, or an inability for us to kind of settle on some conception of the good, or the good life, or a good community. What are the features of good, even what's good for individual persons. And I think that this is a form of sophistry, really. I think we do, in fact, know what's good, by and large. I mean, there are obviously going to be some differences at the level of perhaps religious beliefs that we teach our children, possibly some other sort of at the fringes, you might say, or the more controversial edges of our moral views. But for the most part, we know what we're trying to instill in our children. We know what it is to raise children who have certain virtues and who know how to live in the world in a way that speaks of integrity, discipline, selflessness, thoughtfulness of others. All of us are trying to raise, if we're raising kids at all, it seems to me we're trying to raise kids like that. We may not succeed, but that's the goal anyway. And I think that was one of the things I most liked really about our current Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton's book, much praised and much maligned both, I think. It takes a village to raise a child. The focus was at least correct, right? That the point of the village should be about raising children. Children are not supposed to be a kind of obstacle to the success, to the happiness, the flourishing of the community. They are very essential to it, in fact. That should be our focus. Of course, we're raising our own children, too, but we could use some help maybe from the village. I know it depends on the child. I mean, in my own case, it might take more than a village. It just depends, okay? So that is one of our goals, right? A very important goal of our lives, and we want to make it, I think, an important goal, the goal of our whole community, of our society, of our country. It's personal to this new view, I think, or it's maybe not so new, but anyway, alternative type of pro-woman view, takes personal choices of women very seriously and allows women to pursue very different paths, very different ways of combining their roles, right? Single women, married women, women who have already raised their children, grandparents, that, I mean, maybe at different stages, in fact, we're going to arrange our lives a little bit differently. And that is okay. There's not a kind of one-size-fits-all way of doing it that is sort of authentically womanly, feminine, whatever. There are many different ways of trying to combine these different responsibilities or roles that we have, and it's fine to do it that way. Right? It's fine to take into consideration our own circumstances, our own marriages, and so forth. And I think that women who are able and willing should be encouraged to take part in the public sphere, and in fact should be welcomed, not just tolerated or accommodated in the workplace, in politics, in academy, but it's going to take some flexibility to realize that goal. The kind of feminism we've had that Helen L. Ray has described so well in recent years has insisted, really pressuring women into a single kind of careerist agenda, you might say. 50-50 representation of women in every activity, every job, every profession, which can be accomplished, of course, more than one way. We could have more women in that profession, or we could just fire some of the men. And I won't say which I prefer, but and that women need to escape, as it were, from the private sphere, from their home and family life. Why? So as to compete with men, right? To be, you might say, beat men at their own game, to be better men than men are, if you will, and to prove ourselves as women. And for this agenda, I think the unrestricted access to abortion that is so often seen as Helen said, as a linchpin of feminism, that's absolutely necessary, it seems to me, because women are not going to resemble men, are not going to be able to compete with men in terms of that kind of availability, you might say, to their jobs and so forth, if they're having babies. All right, one of the collections on women that came out, Mothering or something, it was called Mothering. It wasn't really much in favor of mothering. And in fact, one of the essays in the book by Jeffner Allen was called Motherhood, the Annihilation of Women. She was arguing for a 20-year moratorium for women on having children at all, so we could devote ourselves to what's really more important, right? Success in the public square. And this, it seems to me, is completely backwards and also unnecessary. Right? It's unnecessary. Motherhood is not the annihilation of women. All right, so the second aspect, I think, of this new approach is that it's very positive with respect to women's distinctive gifts, values, outlook, priorities, and so forth. That is, it's encouraging more flexibility, you might say, in the public square. More flexibility for women to take some time off, if they wish, to work part-time, to work out of the home, and more valuing of what women do in the home. Right? It's not just, in other words, that women should be permitted somehow or even encouraged to take a kind of